In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the challenging matter of citing sources. We're going to consider documentation's two components, in-text citations and references lists, and web tools that can make your task easier. Let's begin by reviewing the documentation responsibilities that we laid out in the scholarly documentation lecture. First, always attribute any reference to another source, quotation, paraphrase, or summary. Next, always indicate borrowed language with quotation marks. Third, cite the source. Okay, well, how do we go about citing a source? Well, there are two documentation formats. One established by the Modern Language Association, and the other by the American Psychological Association. That's the format we use for CAPS courses. Both of these formats share the same approach to citations. They have two components that interlock with each other, the in-text citation and the list of sources. In the MLA, they call it works cited. For APA, they call it references. Now, the in-text citation is fairly simple to do. There are three key elements: a last name of the author, date of publication, and the page number. Or at least those are required if that information is available and relevant. Here's an example. One great black writer, parentheses, Baldwin, 1979, page 5, argued that the controversy over African American English has nothing to do with language. That's the APA version. The MLA version is very similar. Can you see the specific way in which it differs? Notice that last name and year are the links to the references list at the end of the report. This is where you'll find full bibliographical information. In-text citations are normally found in parentheses, but these can move to various places within a sentence. In that first example, the name and the date and the page number were right after the general phrase black writer. But suppose we said the great James Baldwin. Well, see, there Baldwin has already been mentioned, so his name does not have to appear again. Or suppose we wanted to move that information to the end of the sentence. We can do that too. Now notice key punctuation. Notice that the period goes inside the quotation marks, unless something occurs after the end of the quotation. Then you put the period at the end of the entire structure. Well, that all sounds simple, but there are variant situations. If I'm going to refer to the entire book or article, I don't use a page number because I'm citing not a passage, but the entirety of the piece. Suppose I have two sources from the same author. Well, I distinguish those by date. If it's the same date, it could be 2013A and 2013B. But what if the date is missing, which is very common in internet sources? Well, okay, you don't have a date. How about an anonymous source? Well, there you use a short version of the title for the name in the citation. Perhaps, though, you have an organizational author. Well, then you use the organizational title for the name. For example, Aetna Insurance Group, 2014, page 13. Now, unless you do this stuff constantly, you can't keep in mind all of the different situations you'll find yourself in. If you're in a tricky situation, see the Purdue OWL. At this site, in-text citations, you'll find all kinds of variant situations. For example, if you have an indirect source, a source cited by your source, or if you have a personal communication, you'll find lots of situations there. Now let's make a distinction. In your references list, you do not include all the sources which you've found on your topic. You only list those sources which are specifically referred to in the text, others are omitted. This is the opposite of a bibliography. In a bibliography, you present a complete list of the sources that you've found. Okay, the references list, the trouble is, that's much trickier than in-text citations. There is a basic reference list format, and the OWL lists that with its basic rules. When you have your reference list, you always start a new page. Then you alphabetize the list by author. You also use hanging indentation. In this format, the first line of the entry is not indented, but other lines of the same entry are indented ½ inch. You'll see examples of that as we go along. The basic format for information includes author, then date in parentheses, then title, and then, depending on what type of source you're referring to, publisher or periodical information. This is the exasperating bit, because you have to pick the right one from many different formats. Well, why do you need that? Well, because the different types of sources vary, so the information is going to be different. Suppose it's a book. Okay, that sounds straightforward, but are you referring to the whole book, part of a book, a reprint of an article in a book? If it's a periodical, well, what's the difference between types of periodical, and how will you present the volume and issue data? Web sources, well, that really gets confusing. Let's look at a few OWL examples. First, an article or chapter in an edited book. And you see here that there are two titles, the title of the chapter and the title of the book. A multi-volume book includes not only the main history, but it shows which of the volumes you're referring to. Then, in an ebook, you not only have the basic information, but you also list its availability. With periodicals, you need to distinguish between the type of periodical: a newspaper, a magazine, a journal. Here are some examples from the OWL. Suppose you have a magazine. Well, here we have basically the date in which it comes out. But if it's a journal, you also list the volume number and the issue number. And that's a little different if the whole journal for the year is paginated by volume. It gets really confusing. If it's a web source, you have to be very careful, especially with titles. When you see a title on a web page, is that the title for the page, or is it the title for the whole site? Is it an online periodical in which you have to keep track of the dates? Is it an online encyclopedia or an e-book? Is there an author? Is there a date? Is this an original composition, or is it a reposting of an original source? Was that original source on paper or another web source? Again, in the Purdue OWL, you'll find a list of many different formats for electronic sources. Our lives have been made somewhat easier in recent years by the development of the Digital Object Identifier. And you can actually explore the DOA organization site. This is a number that is unique to a given online document, and it's permanent. It's not going to change. And when you have a DOI number, you don't always have it, but when you have it, be sure to use it, as you see in this example from the OWL. Well, we've been saying how difficult all this is, but actually research databases make your task easier, and they do it in 3 ways. We've already seen in the last module how research databases can give you a very efficient way to access top quality sources. But we also are reassured in that we no longer have to list the database in your reference list entries. There was a time when we had to do so, and you see here the part that's crossed out. APA doesn't require it anymore. But here's the great thing. Research databases often make available ready-made source citations. If you work or study in the field of education, you know that the main database for that field is called ERIC. And the ERIC database gives us the option of copying a proper citation. We look up an entry on African American literacy and we find a listing with an icon which we can click, and when we click it we have the option of copying the correct citation according to different formats, and there are quite a few of them. You see listed here the AMA and the APA. But notice this warning that comes up. You always need to check for accuracy. These automatically generated reference list items are sometimes in error. In the module on research, we already looked at RefWorks, which is a fantastic research tool. It's a place to store research titles, as we've seen, but it's also a tool for generating the citations for individual reference list items and an entire reference list. Now the great thing is that Bethel Library tools integrate with RefWorks. For example, you go to the Bethel Library homepage and use a summon search. Well, let's say you're interested in this particular item, so you click on the permalink link to copy and keep the address. Then you click here on the plus folder icon to store the article, and the source will be added to a temporary folder. You can click that icon to see your stored items. Now notice that this folder is temporary and it has to be sent on somewhere if you're going to keep it. Here's an example of a sample folder with some items in it. Notice the powerful tools. You can choose a citation format. You can also export the sources in the folder to a storage utility, and you choose a format for that, and among your options, the first is RefWorks. Web research is the source of great documentation complexity. It's also the source of fantastic documentation and research tools. Your challenge is to understand the types of source you're looking at, the appropriate documentation format, how to use APA or OWL sites to get it right, and how to get help from web research tools.